In the summer of 2018, I was 12 going on 13, and during that summer I was watching the 2018 E3 showcase on my budget Samsung phone at the time. Being an Android user in middle school was rough. During the E3 Sony press conference, 3 games were shown that caught my eye. The first was The Last of Us Part 2, as that gameplay demo pretty much confirmed that the game was still in active development, even after the complete news drought for so long. The second game that caught my attention was Marvel's Spider-Man, which was going to release in just about a few months from then. However, the third game was what really impressed me the most, and that game was Ghost of Tsushima, which was apparently announced months before, but I didn't know at the time. 2 things stuck out to me about the game, beyond the fact that the visuals were really good and the combat looked satisfying. For one, it was being developed by Sucker Punch, who've made a lot of games I've liked since I was a kid. Infamous and Sly Cooper are games I have a lot of respect for, especially when I was younger. Never finished Second Son, but I still like what I've played. The second thing that caught my attention is that it's inspired by director Akira Kurosawa's films, whose films I liked back then. Now, despite my excitement, a lot of horrendous things happened to my PS4 the following year. My PlayStation account got hacked in 2019, when I was going into my 8th grade year. It was super annoying because I had that account since 2009, but because of that hack, I was frustrated enough to sell my PS4 and the few physical games I had, because most of the games I bought were digital, which was annoying as fuck. I also figured that the PS5 would come out in 2020, which I was right about, so I decided to not even ask my parents for a PS4 again, even during the great scalping era of the PS5's launch. Also, I was playing PS4 games via the PS Now client on Windows. Anyone remember that? No? Okay. However, in 2022, via certain connections, I was able to get my hands on a PS5 that was sold to me by a family friend. I got my hands on games like Spider-Man Miles Morales because I hadn't played it yet, and it wasn't on PS Now streaming, so I had to wait almost 2 years since launch, and I liked the game quite a bit. However, months later, I decided to start playing Ghost of Tsushima, and 16 going on 17-year-old me loved every second of that game's story. However, what set it apart from most games like it for me at the time was that it was one of the few modern open world experiences that I actually felt like doing side missions freely for, specifically during the main story. Most times in general, I usually tend to beeline the main story until it's over, and then maybe do a few side missions here and there before I get tired of the game. Tsushima doesn't even have the greatest open world or anything, and I still felt more inclined to do side content than for most open world games. Granted, I didn't complete the game 100% until the sequel, Ghost of Yotei, was close to being released, but I still enjoyed it. Could it have been trimmed a little bit? Yes, but I still loved the game. Which brings me to the aforementioned sequel, which I honestly didn't have the highest expectations for personally. I still think it looked like a great game from all the trailers, and even the promise of new weapons instead of stances from the last game. However, I also played a lot of Sony sequels that have come out since 2021 or so, and while I still think that most of them overall are pretty good, and I even think some are pretty great, to a degree, they never really pushed the needle for me. I won't be bad faith and say they feel like DLC, like some obnoxious people online have, but while I do enjoy some of the improvements in a lot of these games, even in the ones I'm less favorable of, the games themselves feel rather safe. What's often worse is that you have to take 2 important things into consideration. 1, is the story better? And 2, is it worth $70? Maybe the price hike from $60 to $70 has raised expectations, but if that's the case, you'd expect these sequels to be monumentally better. No joke, most game sequels that have been exponentially better than their predecessors this generation are sequels that have come out after multi-generational gaps between releases. With all of this said, I would say that Ghost of Yotei is kinda like these modern Sony sequels, where the gameplay and even some exploration stuff is way better. New mechanics that make it so I feel almost a bit short-handed going back to the first game. However, we also have to deal with the fact that the story is worse than last time, and not just any stereotypical worse story with controversial narrative decisions, but one that's frankly pretty mediocre compared to last time. However, we'll get to that in time. Before all of that, we should just talk about the game as a video game first. The combat of Ghost of Tsushima wasn't exactly the most revolutionary thing in existence. In fact, it was pretty simple on the surface because it was ostensibly a rock, paper, scissors game with all the stances. One stance broke sword guarding, the other could break spear guarding, the next could break shields, etc. However, what made it fun was the amount of enemies you could place into an arena that forced you to switch between these stances on the fly, along with the fact that each sword swing just felt really good. Tsushima isn't a mechanically deep game, and it didn't really have to be because at its core, it's a Kurosawa movie power fantasy. Yotei continues this mantra, but instead of just using stances, the stances are different weapons. It's functionally the same, but it allows for a lot more variety all the same, and further punctuates how different Atsu is from Jin. With Tsushima, it never really got boring to switch stances, but as a player, you already know that there are only so many ways you can swing a sword. Thankfully, Yotei's focus on weapon switching makes it so that you're not just swinging your katana. You instead get two katana, a spear, a kusarigama, and even an odachi to switch between. The main goal in combat is still to break the enemy's specific guard with a specific stance that counters that guard. Katana breaks katana, dual wield breaks spear, spear breaks sickle and kusarigama, sarigama breaks shield guards, and the odachi breaks pretty much every guard if you're careful enough. Admittedly, when you're just fighting one or two enemies with the same or similar weapons, it is a pretty rigid rock, paper, scissors system. However, what makes both this game and Tsushima engaging is that they throw multiple enemies with different weapons to make sure that you're constantly switching between weapons while dodging everything else. By the time you've mastered this and got enough upgrades in the post-game, you feel the power fantasy the game provides. It also helps that despite the seeming rigidity of the system, you can still break a guard with any weapon, but some are more effective than others. This mainly helps in making the weapons not feel useless and feel completely different, and not just different looking tools with the same purpose. The odachi is especially like this, and it's the one weapon that's essentially just the ultimate fuck you selection, because it can effectively drain any enemy's weapon stagger bars, as long as you know how to use it correctly, due to its slower and more methodical nature. I'm not sure what my favorite weapon was, but I did like the dual katanas in the Yari quite a bit, personally. They even do a good job at giving you cooler ranged and quickfire weapons than Tsushima did. In the last game, they were both pretty basic, all things considered, but they did get the job done. Thankfully, this game takes nearly 400 years past the first game, so obviously there's some sort of technological advancement as far as weapons go. I wouldn't say I use ranged weapons that often, besides the guns, but they're still fun all the same. Using the musket or the pistol to finish off a boss is always really fun and satisfying, because you actually have to time it right to some degree. Yotei even adds the coolest mechanic, which is being able to throw disarmed enemies' weapons. It doesn't seem like all too much at first, but I love doing this because it's so satisfying. It feels badass to just pick up a dead enemy's weapon and then throw it at another guy. You can even do this with the empty jars of sake that you drink out of for more resolve, or spirit as it's called in this game. It's such a cool little mechanic that adds a lot more than you'd think. There's also the wolf that can sometimes be in combat, but if I'm being honest, I don't really care for this. The system itself is fine and still cool when the wolf is there, but said wolf doesn't appear very often on command. The wolf's appearance is often really random, which is a bad thing because I always forgot the wolf was there due to how little the game allows it to fight with you outside of the wolf dead missions. I think the most negligible area that didn't really improve all that much in this game as far as the core combat loop is concerned is stealth. It's not that bad, I'd even say it's still pretty fun to an extent, but honestly, the close quarters combat is so much more engaging and complex to me. Well, complex with air quotes. I do like that you can still do fun stuff like chain assassinations, and if you press triangle and circle, actual chain assassinations, but I wouldn't say that the stealth is exactly much better than it was in Tsushima. The game doesn't really encourage it as much either, with the emphasis on louder weapons like the guns, and with that in mind, I did more standoffs compared to playing the game all stealthy, because it's just more fun this way. Another thing I also dislike in this game is the Onryo's Howl move, because I think that it's just kinda lame. Also, sometimes I swear it just doesn't work correctly, and I don't know if that's a glitch or not. I hope that's addressed in a future update or something, because that's really weird. At least you eventually unlock the actual ghost stance move later in the story, which is functionally better and more fun in every way. Combat overall in Ghost of Yotei is better than Tsushima's combat system in my opinion. I don't know if many others would agree, but the flexibility in switching weapons and the more fun tools at your disposal puts this combat above Tsushima's for me. Yes, the stealth could be better, but I think the core combat is a pretty big improvement. The game isn't exactly the most complex action game ever made, or on the level of something like Devil May Cry or Ninja Gaiden, but that's not what it's going for. Instead of being a super technical action game or a boring RPG, it's more of a power fantasy as said before, and a pretty satisfying one at that. Combat is simple, but it's crunchy and gory enough to keep itself entertaining for the 48 hours I spent playing the game all the way up to the Platinum Trophy completion. On that note, I will say that while it's not a groundbreaking system, the gore in this game is handled better than Tsushima. Admittedly, it still doesn't really go beyond slicing arms off, but this time you can slice two with specific weapons or moves. You can even swing heavy weapons like the odachi hard enough to take off an arm with ease. It's not a huge evolution, but it is a little bit less rigid than Tsushima was in this regard. It just makes the combat feel more visceral, which just reminds me that Sony will literally make any M-rated exclusive have a shit ton of brutal violence and gore as long as it's not called God of War for some reason these days. Traversal in this game is unchanged from Tsushima for the most part, but it didn't really have to be all that much better. You still have your horse, some rock climbing and parkour along with the tightrope segments that Sucker Punch is known for. The movement is decent, not too memorable, but also not annoying. I'll say that the rock climbing is better because instead of having to point the left stick a certain direction to get up a different ledge, it's as simple as just jumping around and it doesn't feel as janky. I think my only real issue with this is that unlike Uncharted or any other game with a similar mechanic, you can't jump in the middle of a rock climb unless you get to the very edge of that rock formation. It's probably more realistic that way, but it is pretty annoying to press X and then just stop moving. Also, the realism counter doesn't really work considering all the shit you can do with the combat, so miss me with all that bullshit. However, one thing I think that this game outclasses Tsushima in are the main story boss fights. Now, the bosses and the side missions are whatever, but the Yotei 6 fights are the highlight. Tsushima's bosses were often just okay in my opinion. They were more memorable for their narrative context and impact than as fights, in my honest opinion. They were often just normal guys with a bigger health bar, which was likely a byproduct of going for a much more grounded style of bosses compared to Sucker Punch's last few games. I think the only thing I liked is that they required some level of patience and timing. The Yotei 6 bosses, on the other hand, while still not amazing boss fights, they are fun compared to the duels of Tsushima, and they're still fairly challenging, just like Tsushima's fights. Some of the fights even have different phases, and I think that's pretty neat compared to just splitting the fights up. One thing I appreciate about Yotei's bosses is that they double down on the cinematic elements of the fights too. I don't just mean scripted QTEs, but the cinematic feel of the duels is increased by having much cooler looking arenas, great music, and cooler phase transitions. It does all of that, yet it never feels like it takes away too much control from the player. It's a great balancing act in being a challenging boss that also feels like you're playing a fight scene from a Kurosawa movie. You fight the snake in the opening mission, and I think it was honestly the best fight you could start this game with. He's drunk and shaky, but he's still able to completely kick your ass. This is the easiest fight in the game, which is fine because it's the opening, and I think it does a great job of both being a tutorial and a cool cinematic feeling encounter. Now, you can technically take on the Yotei 6 in any order, but not 100%. To a degree, you can choose to take on a certain boss first, but you still have to progress to unlock certain bosses. All this is to say, I fought the Kitsune first, past the opening mission. The Kitsune is definitely the top 3 in terms of bosses in this game for me. The only thing that keeps it from being my favorite is that the finisher you do on him is pretty lackluster. There are technically multiple Kitsune fights in the game, but that's only because of the story context in the game overall. All of these fights are fun, but the one with Dojin is so much better, especially with all the phase changes in the cool arena. I then proceeded to fight the Oni, which is probably my second favorite fight in the game. The first phase starts off a little challenging, but you know that this is just the beginning because it feels a bit simple in comparison, which is why the second phase where he starts lighting his sword on fire is amazing. Now his moves are more deadly and hard-hitting, and the change in arena is so cool. I mentioned it before, but the cinematic element of these bosses really elevates it above Tsushima's fights for me. You even get a cool post-fight kill cutscene like the Kitsune fight. The next fight is with the Saito brothers, and I'll say that the dragon is my favorite fight in the game, while the spider is probably the worst fight. The spider's stage play is fine because you know that this isn't the true fight with him just yet, but it's still pretty cool for what it is. Things actually start getting good once you fight the dragon on the beach. This is probably the hardest fight in the game for me, although do take that with a grain of salt as I would say I was pretty underleveled at this point in the game, and I could have done a few more side missions. Either way, he kicked my ass, and this is the best fight in the game in my opinion. I love how the spider's on the sidelines waiting for a signal to shoot you, which tests your reaction time and your skills with receiving audio cues. There are even explosives thrown mid-battle, which makes the fight more interesting beyond swinging swords and shooting. It's overall a great fight, and I think the only issue I have with it is that it could have used an extra phase, but it's still great for what it is. Now, the real issues start where the spider comes in, and this fight is honestly quite a letdown compared to what the dragon set up. It is shown in the story that the spider is the weakest of the Saito brothers and really the Yotei 6 as a whole, but they quite literally make this fight out to be this big climactic cinematic moment, and yet it's just sort of a disappointment. His moveset is fine, and the cinematic elements are okay as far as how they're integrated within the fight, but the fight overall is just underwhelming. It also doesn't help that this is probably the worst fight from a narrative perspective, but I'll get to that when I get to that. After 5 of the 6 are down, you then fight Lord Saito at the old family home, and I think this fight is pretty good. Unfortunately, I don't think it's a great final encounter, and below the Kitsune, the Oni, and the dragon for me, but I guess it's better than the snake, and especially the spider. I think one part where they take issue with the fight is that it's a little underdone done as far as the moveset goes. I think the Oni and the Dragon set the bar pretty high, but beyond using every weapon in the game, I don't really feel like his moveset is all that memorable or cool compared to most others. Saito did kick my ass a lot in the final phase though, which was probably the best part of the fight. One issue I did have with this fight that I found super frustrating was the fact that the new yellow disarming attacks were kind of annoying. These attacks are something you can also do if you have that one upgrade, but when Saito did it, I hated it because you're supposed to do a charge attack if you want to interrupt and stun the enemy, but the timing is really weird for this guy's move specifically. I don't know if anyone else has had this issue or if it was just me, but I found this really annoying and I just opted to do dodges most of the time instead. Otherwise, I still think it's a fun fight, but I wouldn't exactly say it's a perfect conclusion. Either way, it clears pretty much every fight in Tsushima. Bosses are just an improvement over Tsushima. What can I say? They're not the greatest bosses ever or anything, but they are superior to the shallow fights of the first game. Their increased focus on moveset variety and cinematic scale puts them in a spot where I could say I had fun. But of course, these are open world games, so let's get into that. Like I said in the opening of this video, the open world in Ghost of Tsushima isn't the greatest world in gaming or anything, but I did think it was a nice refining of a formula that was growing a bit tired. The Ubisoft-style objective marker-based open world formula was pretty prevalent in the 2010s and even now, but I think Tsushima perfected that formula by making the checklist of activities more visually minimalistic and less daunting. It wasn't perfect and had a pretty repetitive gameplay loop, but for the most part, it fine-tuned a system that was getting pretty stale. I think Yotei is both better and more stagnant as far as how its open world stacks up to Tsushima. I definitely do think that it has much better side content pacing than Tsushima did. Tsushima had too many bamboo strikes, fox dens, hot spring areas, tails missions, enemy camps, among other things that I think really hurt the pacing of the endgame. It's a shame because the story in the game was pretty much perfectly paced in my opinion, but the endgame content was so inflated, artificially so at that. Tsushima had a pretty severe content bloat problem in my opinion, which I think Yotei fixes by just giving it less repetitive objectives. Ghost of Tsushima took me about 65 hours to complete, while Yotei took me about 48 in total to get all the trophies. I think the game can still be a little bloated in some areas, but for the most part, the pacing is far better than Tsushima's. Now, is the content much more interesting on a gameplay level? I wouldn't really say so. A lot of the side missions are usually the same talk to people, fight things, go back to talk, rinse and repeat, but they do have some cool stories attached to them sometimes. I think my favorite side mission is probably the one where you get Jin's sword kit from a petty thief that wants to use it to be powerful and nothing else. The mission pays a lot of respect to Jin, which a lot of weird people thought the game wasn't going to because there's a new protagonist, which was really silly to me, but at least this side mission has a lot of respect for Jin and his impact on the franchise. The bounty missions are 100% worth doing because they have some pretty decent little narrative surrounding them. My favorite bounty is called The Last Brother, which is a reference to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles The Last Ronin, which is probably my favorite TMNT comic ever. The bosses in the bounty missions are kinda whatever, but I think that's fine for these type of enemies because they at least have enough personality for me to not care that much most of the time, and have some pretty cool rewards. The Tails missions in this game aren't as good as Tsushima's in my opinion from a narrative perspective, but I'm okay with that because you honestly don't really need to do a whole lot of them for the trophy this time. I'd rather have them like this than having to do 61 individual missions that can take up 30 minutes. They can occasionally drag out, but I don't really mind any of them as much because you don't have to do them for completion, at least not as many. Enemy camps are largely the same as the last game, but I don't really mind because the game is still fun. They have a good layout and it's fun to fight enemies in these areas because of how much they throw at you. It's an excuse to interact with the combat system more. What else can I say? There are also other activities like sumie paintings and wolf dens, which are pretty decent for what they are and thankfully not as tedious as the last game. Pretty much most of the side content is fine for what it is and thankfully not too long. Even the stupid-ass arrow minigame that you have to do for a trophy at least doesn't take that long despite how bullshit it is. You even get this little puzzle box minigame if you collect all the puzzle boxes from certain enemy camps, or just camps in general from the Teshio Ridge area. They're okay I suppose, but once again, it's not too long, and I even got the platinum trophy right after solving all 12. Thank God they're only unlocked as a result of doing those camps because I would have been looking for hours before getting the trophy. Also, one thing I don't like about the post-game is how you get more skills. So instead of being given skills by defeating a pack of enemies or something of the sort, you instead have to go to these things called altars of reflection. Now on one hand, it is cool that you don't have to get all the skills for an achievement or anything, but the fact that you have to find these on different parts of the map is still a little annoying, and I wish they just brought the skill point system back. I think the problem with the open world and side stuff in general isn't that it's not as good as Tsushima, but it's more so that it doesn't really evolve that much from it. I'm glad it has much better pacing pacing with the side content compared to Tsushima, but otherwise, it's not that much different as far as activities go. You're still just fighting enemies in camps, chasing foxes, climbing shrines, striking bamboo, etc., but you're not doing much more than that. It's not an issue exclusive to Yotei, and a lot of open world games suffer from this, but it's still an issue where I feel like the game just hasn't done much to grow past Tsushima's flaws. It still has the things I like from Tsushima, like the minimalistic UI and fun stories from time to time, but overall, it's not really that much of a big step forward. That's for the most part how I feel about a lot of the gameplay in Yotei in general. It's really solid and in some cases really great and better than Tsushima, but it's not really anything groundbreaking or revolutionary. This is the pattern I've seen in a lot of Sony sequels lately, and this is just another to add to the pile. I hope that by the time we're in the new generation of gaming and still get sequels, that we instead just move the needle forward and not just double dip with a few new ideas. I definitely prefer the core gameplay to Tsushima, but I wish they could have done a little more. However, nothing is as disappointing to me as the main story of the game. I won't spend too long summarizing, but I'll make it brief for those who've played the game already. Almost 400 years after the events of Ghost of Tsushima, we follow our new protagonist Atsu, a woman whose family is slaughtered Kill Bill style by the Yotei 6, led by Lord Saito, after her father Kengo was considered a deserter of the Saito clan along with many others. Having survived being impaled to a burning tree, she somehow gets out of that predicament. I told you this was inspired by Kill Bill. And sets out for revenge on the 6 after 16 years of preparation. On this journey, she reunites with her brother Jubei, who survived being shot in the gut and tossed off a cliff because he had some medical attention, which I suppose could be possible. Atsu also meets Oyuki, who is the original Kitsune, who defected from Saito, which was a super obvious twist in my opinion, but whatever. With all of this, she defeats 5 of the Yotei 6, and then makes it up to Lord Saito for the final boss and kills him. I'll be honest and say that the story was incredibly bland, especially compared to Tsushima. It's a super predictable and cookie-cutter revenge story, which isn't inherently bad, but it doesn't really do all too much to deviate from all of that. A lot of times when it tries to be nuanced, it fails spectacularly. However, there are still some positives. I think that in terms of pure, honest-to-God characterization, Atsu was a much better protagonist than Jin was in Tsushima. A lot of people were ragging on this game before it came out for replacing Jin, which made me feel like these individuals never played Tsushima with how they act like he was such an amazing character. Jin was a blank slate for the most part. I wouldn't say he didn't have personality, but I wouldn't blame anyone who said so. I get that the point was to make him a bland warrior to make the themes work as well as they did, but I could understand fewer people connecting to him because of that sterile characterization. Atsu, on the other hand, is a far more lively and likable character on a base level. She's not just a hardened warrior on a revenge quest, or really stale like Jin. She's able to be sociable and have normal conversations to a degree. She can bounce off other characters, she can joke around. As far as core characterization goes, she's much better than Jin, and dare I say, she's more of a character than him too. Jin works within the story he's given, but he isn't that entertaining on his own. It's the character's journey that's more interesting than his characterization in Tsushima. You can have the best characterization in the world, but what really matters in your multi-hour long story is how good that journey is in combination with the themes and the characterization. Jin may have been a boring character at his core, but what I like more about Jin than Atsu is mainly his journey in grappling between sticking to rigid samurai honor codes and bending those rules to help people. The game didn't make it so that Jin disobeying his uncle/adoptive father, Lord Shimura, was heroic nor evil. There were still consequences outside of the command of his uncle and the shogun. Sometimes more people were put at risk because of Jin's lack of honor in becoming the ghost. There were no good or bad people in the story of Tsushima, just people who were doing what they thought was right. I won't pretend that Ghost of Tsushima had the greatest story in the world, or even the best PlayStation exclusive story in the past 10 years, but I will say that a lot of its themes were more layered and interesting. The entire story was a moral dilemma between honoring tradition and bending it. The ending of Ghost of Tsushima had you pick between two endings for a good reason. Neither of these choices to spare or kill Shimura were right or wrong. I personally picked the sparing option because I felt like it bookended Jin's journey to becoming the ghost way more, even if that implied that Shimura would probably get killed or punished by the shogun for not killing you. Either way, people still debate the morality of that game's ending because of how much of an interesting conflict it was, even if the main character wasn't exactly the most charismatic. In Yotei, I think the main problem is that it doesn't really tackle any interesting themes for the most part. It's mainly stuff you've heard before, and I hate to be that kind of reviewer, but it does kind of revolve into fight for who you love and revenge bad, which have been told in many other stories and far better. I don't hate revenge plots, but Yotei doesn't really do anything fresh or new with it beyond the predictable. Even if the plot is super predictable and the themes are really stale, does it at least have memorable characters? Fuck no. Jubei is super boring despite that him being alive is supposed to be a big twist that we're all supposed to be relieved by. I can't name a single personality trait he has, nor can I properly connect to anything with him. He's just another guy to tell Atsu that revenge is not the best possible route, which is boring. He has no personality beyond that, and it makes his death feel super hollow because he was already shot and pushed off a cliff and survived, and now he's just unceremoniously axed from the final battle, which knocks the wind of this already dull story. Oyuki is no better and is equally forgettable in my opinion. She has this little emotional fight scene with Atsu around the first act where she's revealed to be the Kitsune, well, the original Kitsune at least, which is very good at a gameplay level, but narratively it's so generic. She even does the "if you want peace, kill me" thing, which you know that Atsu won't do if you've played these kind of games before. None of it is interesting in the slightest bit, and that's what's most annoying to me. I think my biggest issue with the narrative are the villains of the game. Like I said earlier, it's very inspired by Tarantino's Kill Bill, where there's a family assassinated by a shady group of people and the main character survives a very lethal attack and starts a revenge quest. Cool, whatever. I mean, I should be glad that they're taking inspiration from one of my favorite movies ever made, but the way that they handle the villains here is where I take issue with the most. In Kill Bill, the Deadly Viper Assassination Squad are absolutely hateable and heinous individuals, which makes sense in the context of this movie. They ruthlessly murder Beatrice's whole family after she deserted them, just like Atsu's father allegedly deserted the Saito clan. The thing that Kill Bill does better is making these guys not likable, nor do they try to make them sympathetic or relatable at all. They are deeply fucked and evil people who even admit that they deserve to die for what they did. In Yotei, it seems like at first they try going down a similar route to the Viper Squad in Kill Bill. The Yotei 6 gleefully kill a father, hang the mother, shoot a child off a cliff, and laugh while they burn the sister of said child after impaling her to a tree. The game in the first half or so makes it feel like these guys weren't going to be some fake sympathetic villains that have a good reason to do what they did. Unfortunately, they do that by the second part of the game, or more so just the last third. I'm not against stories with nuance or understandable villains in the slightest bit, because then I would hate most stories in general. The reason I have an issue with Yotei trying this specifically is because in the opening and in several parts of the game, they literally show us how they happily murdered a whole family with children in the most brutal and fucked up ways imaginable. To make sympathetic villains work, you have to make them do what they do not because they outwardly love it, but because they're messed up enough to think that they have to do it. Many make fun of the newer God of War games by saying Kratos still kills gods, but he's just sad about it this time, but that's actually what you should consider when writing characters. In real life, killing is killing, but in a story, we see what's going on through their heads and how they react to things. If your villains are laughing maniacally as they're torturing and brutally killing children, you can't really make them super sympathetic. I get that the game doesn't want things to be morally black and white, but there are some things you just can't both sides on. As much as people take issue with it, at least The Last of Us 2 handled this a bit more reasonably. Abby didn't kill Joel with a golf club because she's a mentally screwed psycho who does it for the love of the game. She killed Joel because she was angry at him for killing her father in the previous game. Showing a character's specific emotions when doing something messed up is important, even if it doesn't change the actor from being wrong. Also, we already know that Joel did plenty of fucked up things in that first game too. The Yotei 6 cackle while murdering a young girl and her family, but then randomly decide they want to pivot to do the both sides way of storytelling, which would be fine if they had a way of making the 6 likable beyond their iniquitous personalities. They kind of tried to make them pure evil at the start, but then the Oni acts like he wasn't literally in glee when burning Atsu by doing the whole "I was told to" and "do you think I enjoy burning children" spiel.
He defied Lord Saito.
Then you tried to burn me alive.
Do you think I enjoy setting fire to children?
This both sides thing especially gets stupid when Atsu decides to spare the spider of all characters. You know, the guy who disrespectfully tried to recreate the death of Atsu's family that he helped cause via stage play. The modern equivalent to this would be making her death a Roblox game. Now all of a sudden, the game wants you to feel bad for the spider because his dad thinks he's a disappointment or something. It wouldn't even be so bad if they made the 6 to some degree likable. By likable, I don't mean they have to be Marvel quipping every 2 minutes or be nice people. I mean not happy to see children burn and die. These people are not villains you can make into sympathetic people. I get that they want to push the idea that revenge isn't something you should shoot for exclusively and that you should fight for the living and all that. The issue I have is that the theme is insanely bland and their attempt at nuanced villains is so brazen brazenly stupid. If you want a revenge story that was this straightforward anyway, why would you try this hard to humanize these despicable characters? They would have been better as just classic pure evil villains rather than this. I'll say that at least Saito is the closest thing to being that pure evil villain, but he doesn't really have all that much screen time or presence throughout the game. He's rather undercooked, which is a shame because this is the closest thing to a good antagonist in this kind of story. He sadly does miss the pure evil metric because the part where you fight the spider wants you to feel bad for him because his baby daughter died, and that was the reason he killed Kengo. So he's not really saved from this curse of faux nuance. As I've said countless times throughout the story section, I don't care that the game tries to give the story layers. The issues come in when the game tries to use a simpler approach and then tries to force in the layers to make the game seem more deep than it actually is, which is a giant shame. Also, none of these villains really interact with each other all that much besides the Saito brothers, and even then their chemistry is just kind of whatever. I'm not saying that the game should have been generic or anything, but the idea of making this straightforward revenge plot with hateable bad guys conflicts so heavily with how they want to humanize them. Ghost of Tsushima had hateable bad guys and it was still able to form a more complex story. Koden Khan was a pretty simple antagonist, but he existed to push the themes forward and taunt Jin about how his bendy morals got him in this shitty situations. He wasn't sympathetic in the slightest bit, but because of his pure malice, he was still able to challenge Jin's beliefs without having a sob story about how his dad didn't think he was good enough or some shit. I just felt like the story and characters in Yotei were super disappointing and mediocre, and it really sucks. Even from the trailers, I knew the game's story probably wouldn't be as good, but it still had potential. If the side characters were more interesting, the themes more engrossing, and the villains less mismanaged, the game could have had a great story. But what we got is a simple revenge story that thinks it's way deeper than it actually is. I think Atsu is a better main character than Jin as far as personality goes, but Jin's journey will always reign supreme as far as quality of storytelling is concerned. Despite my consistent ragging on the game's storytelling being a lot more bland and predictable, yet also frustratingly tryhard compared to Tsushima, I still really liked Yotei overall. If I didn't like the game as much as I did, I wouldn't have 100%ed it for this video at all. I actually liked engaging with the game and its systems, so much so that I want to 100% more games now, which is something I didn't really do a lot in the past. I think if you just gave me the gameplay of both Tsushima and Yotei, I would pick Yotei any day of the week. The combat feels so much smoother and much more satisfying. The open world content feels less bloated, and the bosses are way better than the ones in Tsushima. It's overall a net positive, but that doesn't mean it doesn't come with some level of disappointment for me. I think the thing that holds Yotei down is the story, which is a real shame because the first game didn't have the best story ever either, but it had a well-paced one, and one well-told. One with great themes and an ending that people still have moral debates over to this day. Yotei doesn't have any of that. The story is a contradiction of itself that tries to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to tell a cookie-cutter revenge is bad narrative, but it also ends up letting the main character take her revenge on him anyway, which is seen as a good thing. They want to make a story where you kill horrid and contemptible villains that laugh at their wrongdoing, but it also wants you to feel bad for them because they want to make them more layered than they actually are. It wants to surprise you with the main character's brother being alive the whole time, but then kills him off in an underwhelming way nonetheless. However, even with these egregious narrative problems that I have with it, at least I had fun with the game overall. I think it suffers from the modern Sony game sequel issue of having better gameplay, but a story that's way worse, while also costing $70. Is it a great game? Yes. Do I think it's an amazing sequel to Ghost of Tsushima? Not really. Hopefully if we get a Ghost 3, we get a better story and it can round out and end the trilogy. Also, I went this whole video without mentioning Assassin's Creed. Ha!